Hi everyone, I'm Ali Nasseri. I'm the former chair of SGAC and an aerospace consultant in Canada. And today I thought it's a good opportunity to maybe talk about some of the opportunities within the space sector, some of the trends that uh, basically started maybe 10, 15 years ago and they are still ongoing, and some of the opportunities that exist in the space sector that people like you could potentially use to put something new out of. Um, so as you all know, when the space activities started with the launch of Sputnik, early space programs were really high-risk endeavors. So because of the fact that the technology was new, the training was new, this meant there's a high amount of risk. Also at the time, there were not a lot of managerial processes in place. Project management, in fact, started with those activities to develop and become guidelines that we follow now. So that was a new issue where those processes at the time were not in place and were just being explored. And the fact that they were doing a lot of things which involved humans or animals in space meant that there was a likelihood of death and injury to people on Earth and to the people involved with the program. All of this means that there was a high risk. And with that high risk, there was also the high cost of investing in developing those technologies and those processes. And if something goes wrong, accepting the lost money that went into developing that project. The other thing was that the cost was not just high, but the return on the investment that you put into the program wouldn't show up until several years afterwards. Because of that, no individual or private company really would accept those risks and the cost, and there was a need for government involvement directly with the program. So at the time, yes, there were companies that were contractors on those projects, but the bulk of the program itself was designed by the government and ran by the government. So what are the rewards of working, I guess, on a space project? Um, you can kind of think of it two ways. You can think of the strategic and economic benefits that come out of this space activity. You have commercial spin-offs where you basically develop a technology for use in space, but then you can use the same technology on Earth. A good example of that is Canadarm, where the robotic technology that was developed for Canadarm on the space shuttle on the International Space Station was then spun off into surgical robots that are used on Earth now. Another example is portable ultrasound, which did not exist, but because in space we don't have any medical diagnostic tools other than ultrasound, that technology was developed for use in space, and then they saw the applicability of it on Earth for injuries that before that were not really analyzed using ultrasound. The other thing is because when you're sending things to space, they are supposed to work in a harsh environment remotely. You need to kind of push the envelopes of science, and that means you kind of develop advanced emerging technologies that then you can use basically on Earth as well. And in terms of innovation within the space sector, traditionally you had three reasons for innovating in space. One was either because of national security requirements, you wanted to be able to take a photo of your basically enemy with a higher accuracy, so you develop technology, or because of science objectives, maybe the scientists want to study something specific and they develop the right instruments to do that. There's the human exploration aspect where we want to basically send humans to space to basically be able to in the future settle in other parts of the universe, and to be able to do that we need to develop the right technologies for them. But the third one, which is the one that really connects well with commercial applications, is the expansion of downstream space applications, or basically the fact that on Earth you have users that they have a specific requirement or they need to be able to do something specifically with technology, and then you decide to send basically the technology that meets that need to space. So in terms of space. Space is obviously growing over time, and this is just an example of the government spending in 2016 on space. And you see that the spending was $62.2 billion around the world. A large chunk of that you see is from the United States, Europe, and China, and Japan, and Russia. India as well are basically the main spenders in terms of government spending. But over the years, there has been this amount has obviously grown the amount of spending, but there has also been a shift where in the olden days you had government spend most of the money in space. Now, 3/4 or 75% of the growth in the space sector in terms of financial growth is attributed to commercial revenues and not really government activities or government spending necessarily. And obviously, the spending has a lot of impact, and that's why kind of countries and policymakers kind of try to spend money on space. So within the US, there are studies that show that every $1 spent on space activities returns $7 in an 18-year period. For ESA, that's every €1 spent returns €3. You see here an example for Earth observation applications. They found that €1 spent is 3.8 euros. And in addition to that, you have obviously inspiring the next generation to kind of become scientists and engineers and try to advance science, but also the large number of jobs that are created and the large number of downstream applications like being able to study health, like providing imaging on Earth, maps and other things that you enable through the space sector. Now, in the olden days, and when I say olden days, I don't mean like 50, 60 years ago, or maybe 10, 15 years ago, as technology that was used in space was becoming more mature, a lot of the digital technologies were maturing because they were being used much more on your portable devices and other things. This led to a fall in the cost and size of technology. So you all know that, like, if you compare your smartphone to a computer that you had maybe 20 years ago, that's what we mean when we say size went down, but also the cost went down as well. And this led to this idea of using commercial off-the-shelf components to send objects, to basically build objects that go to space. So before that, when you wanted to send something to space, you had to buy components that were certified for space. And because those components, there were a lower number of them available, their cost was higher. But now, a couple of years ago, 10, 15 years ago, companies and universities started thinking, okay, why do I need to go and buy this specific component when I can use this other one that I can buy from Amazon? It does the same thing. It's not certified for space. We test it to see if it works, and if it works, we just use it, and we accept the risk that it might fail. In the olden days, governments couldn't do that because the government system shouldn't fail. If it failed, it would affect their budgets and other things in the future. But with a commercial player, they could say, if it fails, I'll just send another one. It's too cheap, so it doesn't matter if it fails. That, along with the miniaturization of electronics, where the capability of electronics increased while its size decreased, meant that they could send objects for cheap and with smaller size to space. There was also studies on how hardware can collaborate. So instead of sending a large satellite with a lot of sensors, you could send a lot of small satellites with specific sensors and then use the data of them together, for example, to create applications that you couldn't do before. All of this technical aspect, along with gradual improvements in managerial practices, moving towards like an agile development environment, meant that some changes would happen in the space sector. And this led to the rise of new space. Basically, private firms didn't need to operate as contractors anymore because they could actually directly sell a product to a user on the market. They didn't need to just sell to the government. And with new players entering the space sector, with these new space players, larger companies that always had the basically felt comfortable because they always had these government contracts, started to feel pressure to improve the way they do things. And then this generally led to a better, basically, space sector in general. These new trends also meant that smaller countries that didn't have space capability, they could have launched their own products to space. They could still build things that went to space, and you had universities building Cubesats, a lot of countries that didn't have access to space, building their first satellites and sending it to space. The biggest change was really in the satellites area because it was the most developed sector of the space industry. It was the most mature. Satellites were used for a long time. And it had the most link with the global economy, which meant that there was a larger market in terms of applications. So basically what we see happening now is we're going from the traditional space where you had navigation constellations, military space activities, space science, human space exploration, some Earth observation, and then some satellites in LEO, GEO, MEO, etc., towards a situation where you have a lot of new businesses trying to provide services that are unique. They're trying to take that data that comes from the Earth observation satellite and see if they can add value to it using Internet of Things or geo information or data analysis. They are trying to build smaller satellites that are cheaper and build their own satellite systems, building new launch systems that are cheaper, and then trying to see if you could build a space tourism industry where people actually pay to be able to go to space, but also looking at things that are longer term, like space resource mining. Can you mine things from space resources and bring them to Earth, which is a very lucrative deal because you can make a lot of money off of, or can you kind of generate energy in space and use that and bring that energy to Earth? And of course, the level of development in these areas, in a sense, is connected to the risks. So if you look at it, a lot of commercial players have entered the launch industry, satellite industry, satellite service and ground segment. There are some companies also working on crewed space exploration and other things, but the number of companies in areas like space tourism and energy mining is lower because the risk is higher in those areas. So those are the ones that are going to be up and coming in the next few years. And the other thing to think about, I guess, when you look at this is a lot of, in the past, a lot of the focus was on upstream applications. So when we said space, people thought building the rocket, building the satellite that goes to space. But there's a lot of downstream activities that have to happen as well. If you launch something to space, there needs to be a place which operates the launch. In the olden days, the government was launching the rocket, so the launch operations was part of government facilities, but now it doesn't have to be. Satellite operations is the same. And then you can also create a lot of value add services based on the data that you get from your satellites or other spacecraft that you have in space, where basically the satellite is always there, it's giving you the data. You try to add value by processing that data, visualizing it a different way, and providing it to the users. So as of 2016, there were 1,459 satellites, and this is expected to grow to 7,000 in a few years. I'll explain why in a second. But if you look at the breakdown, you see that most of the satellites are commercial communication satellites, Earth observation satellites, or government communication satellites, and that's the big chunk. There's a lot of research satellites, 12%, some navigation satellites, but the bulk is focused on communication and Earth observation, and that's not going to change. In fact, in 2017, 345 satellites were launched, 49% were Earth observation, 18% were communication. And in terms of spending, 13.9 billion USD was spent. 16% of that was to build commercial communication satellites, 12% to build navigation satellites, 12% to build Earth observation satellites. And there's one thing you see that 49% are Earth observation, but the cost is 12%. The reason for that is those Earth observation satellites are built by companies that are new space companies. So they're building these for cheap, and they're building a large number of them. And that's kind of where the shift is, where you can build all of these satellites for smaller and for cheaper, and then you can do things that were not done before. And that number is going to grow. So this is a table with some of the planned constellations. If you look there and you add those numbers, you get something like 4,000, 5,000 satellites being planned for launch. And that's where that 7,000 number comes into play. There are a lot of companies trying to build constellations of satellite now because the small satellites that they build are cheaper, so they can build a lot of them, and with that provide their coverage. So this is a global picture. And if you look at this one, for example, these are the Canadian planned constellations, and there are 300 satellites almost planned by different companies to be sent for different applications. You have your communication satellites from Telesat. You have Kepler communications, which is again another type of communication focusing on Internet of Things. But you also have your Earth observation satellites, your global emission monitoring satellites, and other aircraft surveillance and other things. And this does not include larger satellites. These are just the small satellite constellations that are being planned. So every country is kind of trying to enter this arena of constellations, which is an opportunity, but it also gives rise to some problems I will talk later. So basically, there's a, I guess, shift in space with a focus on more downstream applications, trying to not just build and send the satellite up there, but think about how to operate it and how to provide a service directly to end users in the different industries that are involved. And you see that here, that if you look at those numbers there, 102 billion, let's say, is the size of upstream, and it's growing at 1%. 31 billion is midstream, and it's growing at 2%. But look at that last one. Downstream services is 207 billion, so it's almost twice in terms of financial opportunity compared to the upstream, and it's growing at 2%. So it's the fastest growing one, and it's the largest one. And that's why companies are trying to shift in this area. A good example is Planet. Planet Labs was created in 2010 with the idea that you can take off-the-shelf components and build small satellites and send them to space. And these guys, there were 3 of them, they were building satellites in their garage and then sending it to space. And after 2 or 3 iterations, they got satellites that worked really well. So now, in 2018, they have 175 PlanetScope satellites, 5 Rapid Eye satellites, and 13 SkySat satellites. Each of those satellites has a different resolution in terms of what they see on Earth. And in 2018, they got to a point where they were downloading 40 terabytes of data every day, and they could get a full coverage of the Earth in each single day. And that's when they pivoted. They said, we don't need to build our own satellites anymore, because there are now a lot of other companies that build small satellites. And they switched from focusing on the hardware of the satellite to focusing more on data products. So if you go on their website and you look at under products, you don't see satellites. You see planet monitoring, planet tasking, planet analytics. So what they're doing is they're selling their data, and you see the effect actually. If you go on BBC or another news source and you see sometimes these images where you can, there's a slider and you move it back and forth and you can see before and after images. Those images are usually from Planet, because they can see the same location on Earth every day. They are able to actually provide insights into what's happening at each location with good accuracy. Now, there are some new trends coming up nowadays. One is integrating multiple pioneering new technologies with what's existing in space. So you have the rise in AI, and this can help with licensing regulatory filings for space launch. It can also help with the data analytics side of things, with the control of satellites, for example. There's blockchain, there's digital reality, there's cloud services that can kind of provide a backbone for space operations. And if you kind of use machine learning and AI, you can also add a lot more value to the images, because right now, well, I mean, in in the past, usually people had there was a person that had to look at the images and analyze it and understand what that image is. But now you can have a machine learning tool do that analysis for you more accurately. The other thing is we can extend the capabilities of existing hardware by integrating these new technologies. So, for example, if you have artificial intelligence and machine learning, it can do much more with the existing hardware that might be noisy, etc., because it can identify patterns and kind of noise and remove that noise from its analysis. These tools can also be used, for example, to mass produce Cubesats, because they would be able to do the same thinking that the designer does and help us do these faster. They can be used in terms of controlling constellations and how the constellations react, what even the operational model is behind the constellation satellites. Um, the other trend that you see is moving towards a service being a service provider. So if you look at planets, for example, they're no longer built their satellites, but they are providing a service, which is access to the satellite data. And there are a lot of other companies that are doing that as well, really focusing on what value add can they give directly to the customers, because that's where most of the money is, as opposed to actually building the hardware. There's the likelihood, the possibility to use image recognition or speech capture to reduce time and cost of missions. There's the opportunity to use artificial reality and virtual reality to both train people, do activities in space, but also to kind of communicate across borders. And there's also the rise of citizen science, where you have the satellite data as one side of data, but you can also engage the public in adding value to that data by doing small measurements around their countries. But with these opportunities, there's also risk. One of the risks is the rise in space debris. So you just saw the 7,000 satellites that are going to be there soon. And there's also space debris up there, and that space debris is going to be there. So it's going to hit some of these new small satellites. Small satellites also die faster. So this increases the likelihood of being hit by something in space, and we don't want to have that. As you see there, these things are moving at speeds of thousands of kilometers per second. But that's not the only problem. Sometimes these debris fall on the ground. And on the image on the right at the top is an example of part of the Cosmos nuclear powered satellite that landed in Canada, and they had to do some cleaning. But there are other things that come down, the tanks and other things. So how do we make all this process more sustainable? Can we really have that many satellites up there? Is a question to be answered. Do we need to actually move towards satellite servicing to increase the life of satellites, or space debris removal to remove those satellites? Those are two of the discussions that are ongoing for the past 10 years and could be, again, another opportunity in space. This is just to give you an idea of how many objects we can track. So we are tracking more than 16,000 now objects in space, and this is just going to grow and grow and grow. And the risk is you might reach a point where you can't send anything up because it's going to be hit directly. It happened with a lot of CubeSats and small satellites where they were deployed, and as they were deployed, they were hit by something. So you don't want that. Another issue is cybersecurity. So, of course, having space systems gives you resiliency because you have your communication infrastructure on Earth and you have another one in space. but they are also targets for cyber warfare or for hacking. And the question is, how can we monitor for these? How can we ensure safety? There are ideas like doing quantum encryption and other things in space to improve the resiliency of the system. And then the other thing is, how do we properly collaborate and data share? So, for example, we have the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters, and the idea of this is, if there's a disaster and you're part of the charter, you can get access to data from another country's satellites, but these are another country. Now we have commercial players. So, how does this apply to a commercial player that might have data that can help you? Do they give it to you for free? Do you have to pay for it? How does that work? In space exploration now, we have a lot more collaboration and coordination. So the International Space Exploration Coordination Group is a group of these space agencies that are talking to each other and making sure that they're not doing the same thing at the same time, and kind of planning where we go in terms of space exploration. And a lot of this is done obviously at the level of governments, but now private players are also playing a role in space exploration. So how do they come into this picture? So we obviously know what missions are going to happen to go to the moon, to go to Mars. We know we're going to have a China space station around Earth, but are we really looking also at the contributions that the private players are going to have to these plans? What if some private company wants to go and send a mission to the moon? They're not part of this discussion. Could they be? Space has always been seen as a place where states play a role, and with new space, you have to kind of think about whether that's enough or whether you can somehow have private companies also be part of that discussion as well. And finally, there are a lot of legal issues and discussions that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go into the details, but something as simple as, let's say I want to do satellite servicing, what happens if I go and touch another country's satellite? They might think it's war. You don't know. So clarifying the definitions of things in space, liability. There are some treaties in place already that define, for example, liability, define the launch state. But there's a lot more to be done. And also, when I talked about sustainability, how do we maintain sustainability? So we have the sustainability guidelines in place now, but countries don't have to follow them necessarily. And sometimes even those guidelines are not enough. How do we enforce those? How do we push countries to go in that direction? How do we push companies to go in that direction even? Those are still questions that need to be discussed. So I guess I tried to paint a picture of some of the trends in the space sector. And as you saw, I would say we're shifting away from just building hardware to actually building products for the end user. And the product is more its parts. What that means is you don't need to have the satellite necessarily to be able to provide that end product. Sometimes you can be using other people's data, but doing something with it that they cannot do. So it's not just about hardware, but it's about what you do with the hardware and what value you add to the data you get from the hardware. And generally speaking, there's a shift towards downstream and towards integrating emerging technologies with existing space hardware capabilities to kind of push the envelope of what you can do even with the satellites that are already up there. And that hopefully will be the key to where we go in space in the future. With that, I just want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And I hope you have a great conference.